Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are tuning in from around the world. You are in the right place if you're coming for some wonderful insight in our Festival Friday session. Thank you very much for those of you that have logged in on time. I'm just going to sit here looking silent for about a minute while we wait for everyone to come into the room. It's just like in real life, as you know, but in the virtual world, we can see the numbers clocking in at the bottom of the screen. Look forward to seeing you in a moment. Happy Friday. Okay, I am back, and this time we've got more of you in the room. Well, hello everybody, happy Friday, and welcome to Festival of Media's Festival Fridays Masterclass Sessions. And boy, have we got a good one for you guys today. Our last one centered around the metaverse, and I know that we had quite a few questions and thoughts around that. Well, this one goes back to a bit more of the nitty-gritty that many of you are involved in at the moment. Obviously, with the pandemic, one thing that really accelerated during that time was the use of digital in everybody's lives. Consumer habits changed, we changed, more people are using digital formats than ever before, whether it be for shopping, whether it be for understanding how things work, whether it be for watching TV, in fact. So, but what comes with that acceleration? Well, lots of new companies start to develop, lots of new people come into that space, and obviously some questionable measurement and some questionable companies also come into that space. So what happens post-pandemic? Yes, the barriers may not have been quite lifted in the UK yet, but they are certainly starting to lift here and around the rest of the world. But from an advertising perspective, what do brands need to do, and how do they reset after the pandemic to ensure that what they're doing in that digital space is right and is going to the right audience at the right time? Well, to take us there, we've got a fantastic session lined up. We've got two panelists who are going to have a conversation between themselves, but not only that, they're actually going to show you some really interesting insights and some facts which will really help you. So make sure you've got your devices at the ready, you've got your pens and paper for those of you that want to break from the world of digital, and take lots of notes, because it's going to be a cracking session. As per normal, we'd love you all to ask questions. I know you're a very questionable bunch. I'll put together the questions at the end and we can ask them. We've given ourselves some opportunities that we can ask both of our speakers at the end those questions. So bear that in mind, keep them coming throughout the session and we'll have them ready for the end. But without further ado, and this is a great one, you're not going to see much of me, which is brilliant for you. You're going to see our two panelists for the rest of the session. Okay, without further ado, let's invite them to the stage. Let's go. First off, we've got Sean Adams, Global Insights Director for Brand Metrics, and joining him is Anthony Crocker, who's Head of Campaign Innovation at the Telegraph. Anthony and Sean, good luck. Take it away for us.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. Really excited. Anthony and I have been talking about this for weeks now, actually, and we're really excited to be invited into this session. We've got lots of thoughts, insights, data to share with you today. And hopefully you'll find this interesting, and hopefully it will also provoke some questions. So without further ado, we've put together a kind of presentation to help share some of these thoughts. So what we wanted to do was to take the first part of the session to run through, share some of our thoughts, and then we can return at the end, answer questions, have a chat, whatever seems to work. So without further ado, I will kick things off. And hopefully everyone can see that. So So this is us. I'm Sean Adams, Global Insight Director for Brand Metrics, and Anthony is Head of Campaign Innovation at the Telegraph. And we're going to be talking to you probably for about the next 25, 30 minutes, and then room for some questions at the end of that. So first of all, with a kind of nod to the Euros, we kind of wanted to avoid leaping backwards and forwards too much. So we've divided the presentation into two halves. So the first half I'm going to be running you through with a piece I've called Little and Often, and that will become apparent in a few minutes what I mean by that. Then after half time, I'm going to pass over to Anthony, and he's going to talk about metrics that matter. He's going to talk about some of the experiences from the Telegraph and some of the insights that they've gleaned from some of the great work they've been doing with their advertising partners. Just before we kick off the first half, I've got 4 slides I want you to go through to kind of set the scene in which we find ourselves at the moment. I think the first thing, it's obvious to all of us, but just to acknowledge just how much has changed for everyone over the last year. You know, when you think back 18 months ago, from that point, everything has changed, and everything that perhaps we used to take for granted there, we can't take for granted anymore. We've seen dramatic changes in how we live our lives, how we work, how our kids are educated, how we shop, how we travel or we don't travel, how we socialize, what we do for entertainment. So many things have changed in our lives. And at the same time, we've also been, there've been a number of really large conversations going on, almost existential conversations have been going on all around topics like the environment, like gender, like diversity, like nationalism, which all add to this great sort of melting pot of change that's been happening all around. And I think in that context, this quote is perhaps never kind of truer, and that is that a mind that's stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions. I think that's probably the case for pretty much everyone on the call. So much will have changed in our lives. It's unlikely that we'll suddenly wake up one day and everything will be how it was before. And that thought has implications for companies and for brands. We've seen a number of companies having to reinvent the way they do business over the last 12, 18 months. And I think with that, it opens up both opportunities and threats as we start to emerge from the pandemic. Threats in terms of if our customers are changing, have had so much change in their lives, maybe they're reevaluating some of the things they used to take for granted. And brand loyalty might be one of those things that they reevaluate. So just because someone was loyal to your brand in the past doesn't mean they'll be loyal in the future. But I think by the same token, as Jeremy touched on, it does also open up all sorts of opportunities for brands and companies to enter this new space and to start to do things differently. Now, we're going to focus today on the world of advertising, in particular digital advertising. And one piece of positive news is that the advertising market does seem to have shown remarkable resilience over the last year. And 2 pieces of data here to support that point. On the left-hand side is some data from Brand Metrics. For those that don't know, we're a brand lift platform. We work with about 40 global publishers, helping them to measure the impact of advertising on their environments. And as a result of working with all of these different publishers, with hundreds and hundreds of brands, we're able to get a helicopter view, if you like, of what's going on in the marketplace. And the graph on the left-hand side shows the kind of activity that we saw coming through our platform. You'll see pre-pandemic, from February last year, we saw a dramatic drop-off in advertising that was being measured on our platform through to April. In fact, it dropped by 48% between February and April last year. But the good news is, from that point forward, we've seen a steady growth through the rest of the year and into 2021. And indeed, a year on from that low point, the activity that we've measured is actually 30% above the pre-pandemic levels. And that sort of trend is also picked up with the data on the right-hand side, which comes from Group M's recent mid-year forecasts, which were released last week. And in that, they predict a growth in advertising media ad revenue for 2021 of 24%, with digital growing even faster than that. And they also predict that digital will account for 77% of all advertising this year. And even that figure will rise still further next year. Now, as a result of that helicopter view, the other kind of benefit that we have in talking to lots of publishers and also agencies and brands directly is that we get to understand a bit about some of the issues that they're facing in terms of emerging from the last year and starting to plan the future. And there are several key themes that seem to be coming through that we hear time and time again. The first one of those is, when thinking about digital advertising, is that cheap isn't necessarily cheap. There's real concern about the areas of fraud. And although the programmatic supply chain has cleaned its act up a bit over the years, there's still a sense of murky fees that are lurking in there, where you can't truly be sure where all of your advertising investment is going. The second theme that we hear quite a lot about is about data targeting, particularly cross domains, and how it's broken. And I think the days of the Wild West, where you could target anyone anywhere, they're really over. GDPR started that trend, and I think at the end of this year, when we see the death of third-party cookies, and also we see the likes of Apple tightening up on privacy, this is going to continue to be a big issue for advertisers into the future. The third theme we hear more and more is around a shift away from that short-termism, reliance on clicks and performance, and a recognition that actually the brand is really important. And being able to understand brand measures there's a much closer correlation between them and business objectives. And the fourth one, coming out of the pandemic, we saw over that time the importance of trusted media sources in terms of where we get our information from. We saw the emergence of fake news and all the kind of damage that can cause. And I think for all the good points about it, social media has certainly contributed to that in terms of helping to fuel the rise in fake news, and also to increase the sense of polarization in society. And what we're hearing more and more is advertisers acknowledging that and actually wanting to make sure that they invest their advertising expenditure in trusted media sources. So that's a kind of bit of an overview, if you like, of some of the broad issues. And what that's led to is a greater a lessening focus in what we call delivery metrics, where it's all about running your advertising anywhere at low cost. And it's more about higher quality, running it in specific environments where metrics around brand and brand performance become more important. So moving on from that, I'm going to talk for a few minutes about little and often. And what I mean by that is the phrase little and often is a phrase which we can probably apply to various aspects of our lives, whether that be investment, exercise, diet, whether it even be relationships. The idea of doing something relatively small, but doing it consistently and doing it over time can actually build into a kind of a much stronger position and can deliver great benefits. And I want to suggest that we should be thinking this way when it comes to how we measure our advertising effectiveness, to move away from thinking about it as a piece of research and move towards thinking about it more in terms of being a metric. This quote, I'm sure all of you have seen hundreds of times before, but I wanted to start with this one because I think it has particular relevance on this occasion. And this quote, I mean, it's been attributed to various people, but if we take this guy as being potentially the person who first said it, he would have said this. He actually died 100 years ago next year. So this quote comes from a long, long time ago, decades and decades before digital media arrived on the scene. But I think what's interesting is that digital media arrived with a promise of generating lots and lots of data and being hugely accountable. And I think what's perhaps a bit frustrating is that despite all of that, still more often than not, we're none the wiser. So this quote still applies despite the fact we're in this digital world. And why is that? I think one of the factors here, this might help to explain. This is a piece of research which we did amongst various publishers that we work with to try and get a sense of the marketplace and how many campaigns we're running, what sort of size they are, what sort of value they are, and which ones are being measured. So each dot on this slide represents a campaign, and you'll see we've sorted them in terms of size of campaigns and also by value of campaigns. And perhaps not surprisingly, in the top quadrant, you'll see those campaigns that are being measured. So the big, expensive campaigns are almost always being measured, and quite rightly, so they should be. The yellow bubble are those campaigns that are high investment, but perhaps smaller in size. And they will be looking to be measured, but sometimes there are issues around the ability to be able to measure them. Some of the traditional ways of measuring campaigns require campaigns to be of a particular size before it's even possible to measure them. But even so, that leaves an awful lot of campaigns that aren't getting measured at all. Which brings me on to my third and final quote in this particular presentation. And this is based on a philosophical experiment about the relationship between observation and perception. If a tree falls in a forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? I think we can apply the same quote to the digital world. If a digital campaign runs and no one's around to measure it, has it had an effect? And I'd suggest that we just don't know. But if that's the case, why aren't we measuring more campaigns? If we acknowledge it's important to understand what's working, why aren't we measuring more? And here I think there are 4 typical barriers why that's not the case. The first is financial barriers. It's not particularly cheap to measure a campaign, and where budgets are being squeezed and margins are being squeezed, sometimes it's just not affordable to measure as many campaigns as you might like. The second one's resourcing barriers. We work primarily with publishers, and I can't think of one publisher that's been investing in growing their research and insight teams. On the contrary, most of them have been shrinking them. And typical campaign measurements tend to be quite labor intensive. So if you've got a smaller team, you just don't have the capacity to measure as many campaigns as you might like. The third barrier is around methodology. As I mentioned on the earlier slide, some campaigns, the traditional way in which they're measured, are just too small to be able to measure. So therefore, if they're too small to measure, you just can't measure them, even though you might like to. And the fourth barrier is something around comparability. If the approach to measuring campaigns is very much ad hoc and one-off, the tendency is to develop a methodology that just measures that particular campaign without a thought for the campaign that follows it, or indeed other campaigns from other brands. So no sense of scale and comparability. So I think those are four barriers which have traditionally prevented scaling. But looking ahead, how can we change this? If this is all about so much in our lives have changed, why should we take that as the way it should always be? How can we change the process? And here I think there are 3 steps to a different way. And those steps are firstly narrowing the focus, secondly automating the process, and thirdly changing the mindset. So what I mean by that, firstly narrow the focus. The approach that we use with brand metrics is not to try and measure everything. There's lots of things we could measure, but we focus on just measuring 4 metrics: awareness, consideration, preference, and action intent. So no more than that, but to measure that consistently and to measure that time and time and time again, little and often. The second thing is about automating the process. Now, there are probably various solutions out in the marketplace which you could use. I know about the brand metrics one, so let me just touch on that for a moment. We've tried to take some steps to help automate the process. So one way of doing that is turning it into a platform. So it's a platform which is really simple and easy to set up campaign measurements. So it takes about 5 minutes. It could be a salesperson, a research person, an ad ops person, doesn't matter. So that's trying to reduce that resource barrier to make it quick and easy to set up. It's also a SaaS platform as well. So there's a single license fee, a monthly license fee, regardless of how many campaigns are measured. So the idea there is to encourage measurement of lots of campaigns and to not have the financial barrier there stopping you. I'll very quickly explain the methodology. I could spend 10 minutes on this quite easily, but I won't. The approach to try and automate the process is essentially to integrate with the publisher or media owner, to place a script on their site. That script captures both campaign exposures and also then retargets a survey. It does that very precisely, which enables much smaller campaigns to be measured than has been possible previously. Campaigns as low as 50,000 impressions. So that reduces some of that issue around the methodology barrier. The approach is based on a single question, a single standard question, and that single question captures 4 metrics, those 4 metrics I mentioned earlier. And by having that consistent structure, that makes it more comparable. So it addresses that comparability barrier. So the process then captures some information, an algorithm calculates brand lift using frequency of exposure and answer to the question, and then automatically generates a report, and that report compares the results against benchmarks. So hopefully you can see from that snapshot, the idea there is to automate the process as much as possible to reduce some of those barriers to enable campaigns to be measured at scale. But it's one thing being able to measure campaigns at scale, it's another matter to actually make it happen. So I think the third really important thing is to change the mindset and to shift thinking about campaign measurements away from being an ad hoc, should we measure this campaign mentality, into a much more continuous, well, it's almost a question of why wouldn't we measure this campaign? And I think once that mindset shifts, all of a sudden, everything else changes. It starts to be much more scalable. Far more campaigns get measured. Now, this has two big benefits. On the one hand, it has far more post-campaign analyses are delivered, including brand lift data, which is only a good thing. Far more campaigns that were outside of those bubbles in the earlier chart are now included. But for me as an insight person, the thing that's really interesting is this is generating a lot of data, which helps us to generate more insights, more understanding about what's working. And if you think about it, this is some of the data that is being captured with every campaign. Now, on an individual campaign measurement, there might not be a great deal that you can do with this information. But if you start to think about, imagine if I had that information for 20 campaigns or 50 campaigns or 100 campaigns. Imagine what I could do with that data. Imagine what hypotheses I could explore. I think that's where it starts to get really, really interesting. That's another big benefit of measuring campaigns consistently and at scale. I just rounding out my half of the presentation, I just want to give you a quick snapshot of some of the kinds of insights that capturing data consistently at scale you're able to unlock. The first one is around looking at frequency. So frequency is a big topic in the world of digital advertising. And what we've got here, this is an analysis of about 1,000 campaigns which we looked at. And we looked at how the 4 metrics performed at various different levels of frequency. So as I said earlier, frequency of exposure is a key variable that we use in our calculations. And what you can see from this is that the 4 metrics all perform a little bit differently. So as frequency increases, so does awareness. But for the other 3 metrics, they have a different pattern. They rise to a peak and then diminishing returns start to kick in. They start to decline. I think this kind of information is really interesting in terms of planning, particularly if you're looking at effective frequency caps for campaigns. This one here, this slide is actually from an event put on by The Guardian and Permutive recently, where they ran a lot of campaigns measured using brand metrics, and they were looking, one of the areas they were looking to do was to look at the relationship between campaign objectives and formats. So they were interested to see, does a particular format deliver better, is a particular format better at delivering a particular objective? So in that example there, for instance, they found that 100% share of voice and takeovers had a particularly strong effect in driving the awareness metric. So having that kind of data and understanding, okay, if I've got this objective, which formats are best suited to deliver it, can become really powerful. The third one is looking at targeting. A lot of digital campaigns have targeting attached to them. And this is looking at perhaps a slightly more nuanced view of that in relation to the individual metrics. So if you have a campaign where you're looking for to build awareness, then maybe targeting is not the way to go. But on the other hand, if you're looking to drive action intent, then it can very much be the way to go. This example here, we were really interested in what was exploring in a bit more detail, what was going on after lockdown. So what we did here, because we had lots and lots of campaigns, historical campaigns, we picked some industry categories and we had a look at pre and post lockdown. So what you're looking at here is 2 categories, consumer electronics and furniture. The light coloured bars are the average lift across the 4 metrics for a whole bunch of campaigns in that category prior to February last year. And then the darker bars are categories that ran after the lockdown in the same category, and what's the average lift across the 4 metrics there. What you can see in these examples is that there were greater levels of lift post-lockdown than there were pre-lockdown, which helps to support that narrative around it's really important for brands to support themselves during a time of downturn. And hopefully those brands that were responsible for those campaigns are now in a stronger position as we emerge from lockdown. Penultimate one, something else you can look at. You can look at the audience segments and how different audience segments deliver against different metrics and compare them against other segments. And the final example here, looking at longitudinal trends. So what you can see here, each one of those charts represents a single advertiser advertising with a single publisher, and each bar represents a different campaign. So you're seeing here the cumulative effect, a cumulative baseline effect of continuing to invest in the brand over time. And you'll see how that affects the different metrics. You can see awareness broadly continuing to rise over time, a largely upward trajectory in some of the mid-funnel metrics, and a slightly more erratic pattern when it comes to action intent. So again, the kind of things that you can do if you're collecting this data at scale. One final thought here, one final piece of analysis, which we were really interested in comparing those of the publishers we work with that measure loads and loads of campaigns and those that measure fewer. And here you can see if 100 is the average lift delivered by campaigns that we measure, those publishers that are not measuring that many, they're measuring up to 25 a year. So that's an average of 2 campaigns a month. You see there, the average lift that they were seeing from those campaigns was below the benchmark. Whereas on the right-hand side, those companies that are measuring at true scale, sometimes more than 100 campaigns a month, they're not only collecting more data, they're not only providing data for more campaigns, but they're also seeing better results. And I think there's a virtuous feedback loop there where they're measuring more campaigns, they're getting more learnings about what's working, they're feeding those learnings into future campaigns, and they're seeing the results in terms of future campaigns also outperforming. So there you have it. That's my rationale for thinking perhaps a little bit differently as we're reevaluating lots of things that we do. Let's think about advertising effectiveness, not so much as an ad hoc piece of research, but more as a metric. How can we measure campaigns continually and at scale and turn it into a metric, thinking about it little and often. Okay, so half time, and my great pleasure to hand over to Anthony, Head of Campaign Innovation at the Telegraph, to take you through the second half.
Thanks, Sean. I'm sorry to say this is where the football analogies end, unfortunately. Not much a football fan myself, but hopefully an interesting presentation nonetheless. So for the Telegraph, the story around metrics that matter really started in 2018 when we kind of really shifted our ambition and focus onto a subscription strategy. That meant that we really rethought the way that the layout of our website and the reader experience that we were delivering. And we knew that was better for advertisers, but what we were increasingly seeing was that actually the standard metrics that we have in place and that we use across the whole industry were really not helping us demonstrate that value and the kind of the effectiveness of the campaigns that we were delivering and how much better they would potentially perform as a result of a reader first environment. So we came up with the Metrics That Matter program to kind of look at how we could readdress some of those concerns and the blind spots that we were seeing in the industry in the way that we were reporting effectiveness, but also look at how we can help change the conversation across the whole industry, really. So that's kind of split into 3 sections. Attention metrics, we actually use Moat Oracle to look at how we measure and optimize towards attention metrics. So we've got nothing against a click-through. The click-throughs are absolutely fine, but that click-through needs to be delivered within the context of how somebody's engaged positively. If we can prove that we've driven a high click-through rate through responsible delivery and through positive engagement, then absolutely fine. But unfortunately, as we're all aware on this call, quite often that click-through rate, because it's delivered without any additional context, it can be gained quite easily and actually is delivered through quite a negative user experience, which is definitely not good for the brand. So we use attention metrics to optimize towards those more kind of softer, kind of positive user experiences, but also to help kind of confirm and give context around good performance on those clicks. Brand metrics, and until we started working with brand metrics, they were really almost non-existent in terms of delivering that on a campaign by campaign basis. As Sean previously mentioned, brand metrics tend to be for campaigns that spent really big budgets, could be quite labor intensive, and we're not really accessible to the kind of that mid-level campaign activity. So working with brand metrics has been fantastic to be able to look at integrating how effective we are from that sense. And the final thing that Metrics That Matter looks at is those commercial metrics. So as a brand platform that really kind of sits at the top of the funnel in terms of where we deliver effectiveness, we are concerned about some of the attribution models that are currently in place. And actually, if you think about the changes to the third-party cookie, those attribution models are kind of going to become defunct, a lot of them. So we really wanted to look at how we could change the conversation around commercial metrics and demonstrate the impacts that we've had long term, but at the beginning of a customer's experience with a brand. Next slide, please. So we a lot of the basis for that came from, Sean, are you able to pass on to the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So the basis for a lot of this insight came externally. I'm sure many of you on this call are familiar with these organisations and the reports and the research that they've created, but this is just a summary of some of the key research that we use to really kind of firm up the insights and the feelings that we had that there was more to it, that we needed to demonstrate the value of that kind of attention quality, that there was a direct connection between the quality of the editorial and the content that somebody's experiencing and the ads that share that space responsibly, but also look at the relationship that a brand kind of value that a brand identity has and how that impacts a publisher identity and vice versa. So I've kind of said to Jeremy, I'll share the links to these. These do link out, but I'll share the links to these afterwards so that if you want to get more information on this kind of research, then I would thoroughly recommend it. It's a great kind of summary of some of the work out there that demonstrates, the importance of considering value. Next slide, please. The other thing that we did is we ran an internal survey and asked our readers whether they were more or less likely to consider a brand to be reputable if it appeared on certain platforms. And the results were really interesting. What we found was that actually quality news brands and TV was driving a really high level of trust for brands. So if a consumer sees a brand within an environment that they consider to be regulated and trustworthy, they're more likely to trust that brand. And actually what we were also seeing was that there was quite a stark difference between then where we considered tabloid and task-based sites, and at the bottom actually social and user-generated content platforms were actually driving quite high levels of distrust. And I think if you look at the overall landscape around digital advertising, there's a perception that trust is being hemorrhaged, that actually overall there is no trust at all. When you break it down like this, you can see that actually there's varying degrees of trust, and actually for a quality, well-established brand that's regulated and responsible and accountable, the trust levels are really high. But because social is so dominant across digital, that's kind of owning the conversation around trust. And the reason that's really important to us is because we think that trust is the ultimate metric. Even if your brand is relevant and kind of needed and great, if your consumer doesn't trust your brand, they're still not going to invest in it. So this really for us was a kind of key turning point of saying we need to look at how we can demonstrate that what we deliver is above and beyond the expectations of a typical digital campaign. Next slide, please. And actually in the last year, for obvious reasons, it's become a lot more than that for us. It's not just about demonstrating that a quality editorial environment is better for advertisers. It's become about actually demonstrating that a quality editorial environment is incredibly important to the world we live in. The chart that I've shared here is from the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it shows that across, I think that's something like 10 countries there, it's probably more, there was a stark difference between those that had good information hygiene, so those that were regularly consuming quality editorial, versus those that had poor information hygiene, those that were typically kind of consuming clickbait and fake news through kind of, social aggregation, for example. They were much more likely to have vaccination hesitancy. In fact, globally, the difference between the two was an 11-point difference. So there's, it's having an impact on the world we live in. And as long as people are optimizing towards those performance metrics, and they're not really considering how they're, where their advertisers are spending their budget, they're going to continue to fund and develop these kind of fake news, clickbaity environments. And actually that's taking money away from professional journalism. So we really are, taking that to task and asking advertisers to really think about, in the same way that you'd think about where you source your raw materials from, think about where your advertising budgets are going. And are you really kind of consciously making good, positive choices that lead to good, positive global outcomes? Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of an overview of metrics that matter, at the moment, we've really got that now down in 2 areas. Attention metrics, we look at 11 metrics in total, but those 11 metrics look to answer 3 key questions. The first one is your ad not just in view, but is it in view for a meaningful amount of time? So it's not just about driving up an in view rate for the sake of it with an average in view of half a second. It's also about making sure that we've given the consumer enough time to take that message on board, to drive up recall rates to an optimum level, and all of those things that are really important to advertisers to kind of, drive the best out of their budgets. Is the reader engaging with the content? So can we demonstrate that the editorial content that sits alongside that ad is being consumed in a positive way? We know that if people are engaging with that at a higher level, that they are more likely to engage with the advertising in a positive way and kind of put those positive attributions onto that brand. And then finally, it's all about looking at engaging with the ad. So it's not just relying on a click-through rate as a single metric for engagement, which in reality, getting people to click through to your site isn't the be all and end all. Especially for a luxury brand or a high ticket item like a car, for example. Nobody's expecting them to see an ad on the Telegraph or any other platform and immediately click and buy that product there and then. But it's about that long-term engagement and how we are kind of building up a brand relationship. So are there other factors that we can use to demonstrate that they're engaging with that ad and that engagement is kind of at a really nice high quality level? And then brand metrics, and as Sean's already kind of gone into detail, we look at how we can demonstrate we've increased awareness, consideration, preference and action intent. The next stage for us is definitely going to be looking at those commercial metrics. And now that we're exclusively a first party data managed platform, we have a really strong we've built out our first party data because it is a subscriber audience in a really strong way. We're looking at how we can use products like Telegraph Unity, which is our data matching capability. So we want to work with brands to do data matching, not just pre-campaign for targeting, but actually post-campaign to demonstrate that 6 months to a year down the line, an ad that somebody had seen on the Telegraph has had an impact on their purchases decision, further on. It's not just about relying on those last click attribution models to demonstrate, how a campaign has been successful. We want to demonstrate that we were there and we made a difference in terms of the influence at the earlier stages. Next slide, please. So that's helped us do a number of other things. Obviously, it's great for us to be able to look at how we can support campaign activity for individual brands, but actually it's helped us do a number of other things at a broader level. So this chart here is the first one I'm going to share with you. When March 2020, which seems like a million years ago to all of us, but actually there was a lot of fear from brands that whether or not they should be advertising. A lot of brands were considering pulling their spend. Was it appropriate for them to be kind of sending out a consumer message at a time that was kind of particularly stressful for a lot of people? And so we wanted to prove that actually, it was a really great time, that actually that people were looking for reassurance, they were looking for some sense of normality, and we're actually, getting a level of comfort from being consumers. But more than that, attitudes towards our platform changed. So we were seeing traffic coming into our site at a phenomenal level, but interestingly, not just coming in through social links. People were coming to the Telegraph homepage and then using that as an index for further reading. And so it was really about us demonstrating that actually people were scared and wanted reassurance that the news they were reading was valid and verified, and they were going to trusted news sources in a way that they hadn't done for years and years. And as a result of that, we were able to demonstrate that actually there was a shift in the way that those brand metrics performed for advertisers on our site. So we were able to first demonstrate that awareness and action intent didn't really change. People were still willing consumers. But because they had changed their perception of the Telegraph as a brand, then things like consideration and preference for brands shot up. So the average preference, as a standout example, before March, it was around, we saw a 1.5% increase on brand preference for advertisers. But post March, we were seeing, on average, a 3% increase on preference for brands. And we really think that's a demonstration of that connection between the two things, how people perceive the Telegraph as a brand and how they perceive brands that they see within that environment. Next slide, please. The other thing that it's helped us do is, so the other thing it's helped us do is look at how we can create a dialogue and metrics around how subscribers actually react to advertising. We were really keen to dispel myths that once somebody subscribes to an environment, they are almost resentful of advertising because they feel that they've paid for something, they then shouldn't be receiving ads. But actually, all of our evidence suggests that when we deliver an ad responsibly, that doesn't interrupt or kind of distract from the content that somebody was there to read in the first place, when that ad is relevant, people are really willing to engage with it because they see it as a kind of legitimate part of that environment. And the example I always give here, and definitely the kind of the sort of the mindset that we're trying to go to with the way that we approach our advertising, is really thinking about having an editorial approach to the brands that we work with, not just taking any brand that's willing to pay, but actually saying, is this brand aligned to the Telegraph in terms of our editorial agenda and our readers' passion points? And the kind of the example I always think of is something like Vogue, a premium fashion magazine that people are willing to pay a premium amount for. And yet the first half of that magazine is advertising. And so, but because that advertising is relevant and within context, people accept that as part of the editorial experience. So we really think there's a big opportunity for quality publishers like the Telegraph to think about their advertising as part of the editorial consciousness, and how that can be not just relevant, but actually additive to the brand. Next slide, please. And the final two slides from me, actually. So the first one is, it's been fantastic for us to be able to demonstrate to advertisers the real importance for things like rich media and high impact formats. So anecdotally, we've always said, we understand that if you have, video, you use animation, or if you use some of our really kind of cool high impact formats, then that's going to drive that's going to have, a better impact on consumers. But what we've been able to do through using brand metrics tracking is actually demonstrate that and actually put tangible numbers against that. So we did a test where we split out all the campaigns that hadn't utilized rich media and those that did. And what we were able to demonstrate is that on average, specifically preference and action intent will over double what you would typically see as a kind of increase when advertisers had used rich media and high impact formats. So that's been fantastic for us to be able to kind of go back to advertisers with that evidence that they should be investing in good quality creative. And finally, we're looking at kind of audience insights as well. And actually, people are quite often looking for that magic bullet, what's the specific type of audience that I should send this campaign to? And actually, all of the evidence is showing us that a blended approach really is the best approach. So trying to get the best of both worlds. So again, here, what we did is we split out all of the campaigns that we'd run through brand metrics. We looked at all of those that had just sent out a campaign through audience targeting, just those that had sent out a campaign using context targeting. And then we looked at campaigns that had done a combination of the two things. And what we found was that those that used historic behaviours to deliver audience interests, they actually had a much higher initial brand standing. So it was more likely that that audience would have a pre-existing relationship with that particular brand. And as a result, you don't typically tend to see higher increases in that brand. You don't drive up that brand standing because they already know about it. They're already an action intent. They're already kind of where they need to be. Still incredibly valid, because actually what you're doing is creating immediate relevance to that brand and kind of putting that brand front of mind to a relevant audience. But you're not necessarily growing that audience. On the flip side, with context, is you're hitting people in the immediate relevant context. And so they don't necessarily tend to have that historic affiliation to the brand, but you do tend to see the brand lift driving up there. And so as a result of that, when you kind of take the positives from those two things, kind of the one on the other, put them together, as a compounding effect, we can see, especially in consideration, preference and action intent, the kind of post-campaign brand standing for those brands was kind of outperformed the other two targeting methods. So this is, again, kind of some of that evidence that we're pulling out to really help brands set up their campaigns to deliver in a responsible, relevant, and a kind of editorial conscious way. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, I had one final sort of summary of just sort of four kind of key points that that we went through, and an opportunity for one more gratuitous football analogy. So these were just four thoughts around resetting the digital advertising agenda. The first one is around the importance of context, that good brands deserve good environments. And it works in reverse as well. Good environments deserve good brands. There's a symbiotic relationship, I think, between the two. The second one, as Anthony's been just talking about, metrics matter. Important brands base decisions on what's really important. So what data is important in order to be able to make informed decisions, and making sure that you have that available as often as possible. The third one's around consistency. Enduring brands, it's about measuring performance consistently over the long term, little and often. And finally, vision matters. Visionary brands using past data to help plan for future success. So our view on the best use of advertising effectiveness is not just to look through the rearview mirror to see what happened on the last pack campaign, but to take those learnings and inject them into the planning for future campaigns. So that is us. So hopefully I will stop sharing now.
Thank you, Sean and Anthony. Fantastic, some compelling facts and data in there and insight. Absolutely brilliant. I actually, quite frustratingly, Sean, I actually had about 3 questions which you answered in that final slide. So,
all right.
But no, I still have more. Don't you worry about that for both of you. Just the kickstart. I know the audience, and Sean, you kindly answered the question in there, which was fantastic from the audience. But just to kind of, we've got a bit of time for a couple of questions. I was going to ask from an educational point. You both touched on it. Is still the biggest kind of challenge of brands trying to understand how important metrics are, the educational piece. Are you finding actually what is that? You talk about a silver bullet just now, and it's like, what is the key thing that the brands who are watching this need to take to their bosses to say, actually, we should be doing stuff like this, and this is what we should be doing, and this is how we should be doing? What's that one piece that they need?
I suppose from my perspective, when we talk to brands, we try and encourage people to just have a bit more confidence around the long-term impact of brand metrics and stop chasing those short-term, goals. There's so many metrics out there that will give you an immediate result, but actually they're not necessarily delivering long-term what you're looking to achieve. So, that's why we're trying to work out how we can come up with a new attribution model that says, that demonstrates how important it is to lay the foundations of a good brand relationship and not just drive performance metrics and last click attribution. because yeah, in the short term that's going to give you what you need, but actually, you know, the long term it's going to be doing a lot of damage. I've spoken to a couple of brands that really understood that, and there was a charity brand that does a lot of work around Christmas, for example, and they said, you know, they've done a lot of work with the agency because, you know, they were seeing, you know, great initial responses on social platforms, but that was like one-off donations for a £5 here, £5 there. But actually their big money comes from people that go and sign up to do, you know, a monthly subscription or, you know, a monthly donation. And he was like, people don't just, you know, log on to, you know, and Google's taking all that attribution, but people don't just on the 22nd of December go, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just donate money to that brand. It's because they've been part of, you know, a 2-3 month long campaign that's led them to make that decision. And yet, what do we have in place that helps measure the impact of seeing that, you know, on a bus, or seeing it, and actually especially in the digital world, we put so much emphasis on attribution and proving that that thing there and then has made a difference. So that's why we're really keen to look at how we can change the conversation around that and really demonstrate that kind of long-term impact that we have when we're sitting at the top of the funnel. Yeah, that would be my kind of response to that one.
And just adding to that, and one of the slides that I had in my section showed the kind of the longitudinal effect. So the effect of measuring campaign after campaign, but just doing it consistently. And I think there's a real benefit there. If you keep collecting those metrics consistently over time, you can start to kind of you know, develop hypotheses, explore, understand what's working better and worse. And not every campaign is going to work, but I think the key is to be able to understand the ones that aren't working, why they're not working, and then to be able to diagnose that and fix them and come back with better campaigns in the future. And that's not always going to be easy to understand if you're not collecting metrics around the brand.
Absolutely, and we've got a question from the audience. Once you start, you see they start to come in. This one is for you, Sean, actually, to start with, but it is, who is leading the way in putting in place context, vision, metrics, and consistency matters? Who would you call out as actually doing it right?
Blimey.
Could it be the Telegraph? I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, and absolutely. I mean, I think I suppose it depends whether you're talking about from a kind of a brand advertiser point of view, whether you're talking about owner of context, or whether you're talking about the organization that's trying to measure all of that. So, you know, there could potentially be pioneers in all three ways, but I don't know. But, you know, obviously, you know, the kind of brands like the Telegraph have got great context and are kind of all about trying to understand that. I wouldn't, there'd be no one I would necessarily call out as real pioneers in that area, but I think it's increasingly important to understand the importance of context, because you know, the kind of old you know, the medium is the message, I think is still very relevant in a digital environment. You know, that where you see a message actually contributes to what you take out of it. So I think if you kind of have that as a sort of a baseline level of kind of understanding, then it's, well, okay, well, if that's the case, how can I understand, how can I measure that, really? How can I understand what's working, what's not, and how can I make sure that, you know, my brand is appearing in contexts that really help to support and enhance how people view it?
I would say for the brands that we work with as well, like luxury brands have always been really switched on in terms of the importance of context, and that's great, and that works, and it's great when you get a non-luxury brand that does that as well. So we've got a case study, I can share it with you afterwards, for Zoopla. We did a lot of work with Zoopla last year, when the housing market was kind of stopped and people, you know, literally physically weren't allowed to buy and move houses. They wanted to do a lot of work to kind of help build up their brand and their kind of brand affiliation. And so we did a lot of work around context where stuff around cooking was talking about you want a bigger kitchen, you know, stuff around, I kind of think it was like politics and education was looking at like a home office, you need a home office, and gardening was you need a bigger garden, whatever. So, and it absolutely, and that was actually done in combination actually with Unity. So we did a data match with them as well, and it absolutely stormed it. It was a fantastic campaign. I think I can't remember off the top of my head, but one of the metrics was 6 times higher than the benchmark in terms of the increase that we saw. And it was like the biggest increase on any campaign tracking that we'd done with brand metrics. So it's great because people think like, oh, luxury has to be in a kind of luxury lifestyle environment, and cooking has to be here, and that's really obvious. But it's great when not so obvious brands take that leap and do something contextually, and it really works, and you can demonstrate that that is working, because all brands should really be thinking about it.
Absolutely, taking something that's slightly different, being innovative, being clever, that's certainly the way forward. I mean,
yeah, like not just going into property, like, you know, that's the point. Like, not just say, oh, we're just going to stick everything in property because we're Zoopla. Actually, no, like, how was your brand being used in somebody's lifestyle, and how can you make that relevant to other contexts? That's the clever thing.
Yes, yeah, making it culturally relevant, right? So it fits into subcultures, different cultures. I suppose one of the continuing problems, which I'm hoping the pandemic has accelerated, is that previously and before this, people were very much, they'd have this data and they weren't sure what to do with it or how to use it. And, you know, Sean, you mentioned there the metrics matter, and the vision matters, right? And people actually understanding the metrics they've got and how they work and how they go forward. Have you, over the last 12 to 15 months between you, seen a real change in the attitude of clients, in sense of actually they're now starting to realize, crikey, this is the key thing for us, this is important, and we're putting things in place to actually be able to make use of the data?
I think for us as well, one of the big drivers has been the changes to the tech and the kind of the issue with third-party cookie, and it's kind of woken people up to suddenly go, oh, actually we need to think about how else we can deliver a campaign that's going to be relevant, and that's great. But my fear is that I don't want it to swing completely the other way, and people just to completely go, oh, audience doesn't matter anymore, interest, targeting doesn't matter anymore. It's all about context, because it isn't. We are starting to prove that actually it's about overlaying those two things and being clever about how you use those two things in conjunction with each other. And I think we are hopeful that publishers like ourselves are in a really good position to offer that in a really kind of relevant way, because we do have first party data, and because it is mainly subscription audience, that's quite rich first party data as well. So, we're in a really good position to look at offering that. But that would be my only concern, is that I don't want brands to suddenly go, okay, that's it, it's all about context now. And then we just throw out all the great work and that we've done to understand how audience interests can be used in an effective way.
I think from my perspective, and we're sort of relatively new to the UK marketplace, probably the last 2.5 years. And I think in the early days, it was sort of the pioneers like Telegraph and a few others who sort of embraced the opportunities of being able to offer kind of measurement across small campaigns. And I think in the early days, perhaps some of the advertisers who were receiving the reports were kind of not familiar with getting such a report. They were used to kind of getting nothing. So initially it was a bit of a novelty, but I think what's happened is they've increasingly run additional campaigns. They've kind of come to expect that, and they're kind of able to compare campaign to campaign, and also to get a sense of how their campaign compares against benchmarks. So I think it increases the whole kind of appetite for getting more better brand-led data, and for it to become, instead of a sort of, as I say, a bit of a novelty, it becomes more of an expectation. And I think the more the industry is talking about these kind of issues, the better for everyone.
Absolutely, that educational piece is key, right? I think that's key, getting that message out there, the amplification. So look, we are kind of out of time, but it's been a great discussion. I have many more questions, but I suppose we should finish on, what one or two things should brands take away for the future? What pandemic lesson, what would you say they should definitely do when it comes to ensuring they're getting the most out of their campaigns from a measurement and a metrics perspective?
My number one thing would be, don't take the metrics that are being put in front of you at face value. Understand how they're working with each other. So, if you're seeing a really, really high click-through rate, be suspicious about that. How is that click-through rate being driven? And actually, is it, actually driving a really negative brand experience? And so, yeah, like, don't be afraid of complicating your metrics measurement. So people often say to me, oh, CTR is great because it's just one thing and I can understand it. And if it's up, it's good. And if it's down, it's bad. But actually, that's what's led to that being so exposed to being kind of tricked and gamed. So, you know, embrace the complexity of some of the other metrics and how they relate to each other and how they give you context for the overall kind of observation, you know, how a campaign's performing. And don't just kind of be blindsided and kind of shove all your budget into one thing because you think that's performing really well, when actually it's kind of potentially doing the complete opposite of what you want it to do.
Yeah, and I pretty much echo that. I think sort of kind of, you know, with all the data available, kind of, you know, not concentrating so much on more kind of delivery metrics, if you like, but kind of thinking more about, you know, small b brand metrics and, you know, how your brand's performing and to focus more on that, because that's probably more closely aligned to business objectives.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Anthony and Sean. What a great session, everybody. We will have the video up and running for you for next week, and we'll also have the links that Sean is going to provide us as well. We'll put that in there. If you have any more questions or anything, I'm sure both Sean and Anthony will answer them offline for you as well. They are very easy to find in LinkedIn, so don't be scared or shy to connect with them. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of Festival Fridays. There's apparently a big football game though. There's a huge football game later if you're into football, even if you're not. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Anthony and Sean, thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.